Aziraphale looked up from his book when he heard Adam babble about a dog in the yard. Since Adam was currently going through a phase where every animal he saw was some kind of dog, this could be anything, and he didn't like to leave well enough when it could be something harmful. As he drew nearer, he saw that the dog Adam had spotted was a snake, climbing over the crumbling corner wall of the garden. Aziraphale took Adam's shoulder and pulled him away as quickly as he could without outright alarming the boy. "No, Adam, you must be careful," he said, and when Adam babbled to him in his incomprehensible toddler speak, went on with, "This is a snake, my boy. Marvelous creatures, but many of them are harmful. You must always be wary of them." Crowley preened at that. It shouldn't be possible for a snake to preen, but he was no ordinary snake, and preen he did. "That's right," he thought. "Beware of the dangerous snake." He reached the top of the wall and got to work draping himself over it, radiating smugness as he rested his head on his coils and sat staring the boy in the eye. While he did that, the man peered closer at him. "You'll find, in fact, that our handsome friend here is just a common grass snake," he said. Crowley raised his head, offended. "Common? It's quite harmless, really." Crowley hissed. "Harmless? He wasn't harmless. He was a menacing and dangerous goblin king. He ate babies for breakfast and their guardians for dinner. He was cruelty incarnate." Okay, he didn't actually eat people, even babies. But he wasn't harmless, and he resented any implication otherwise. On the other hand, the man had called him handsome, hadn't he? Maybe he'd let it slide then. Crowley lowered his head to rest on his coils again and stuck his tongue out. The boy mimicked him. "Come along, my boy," the man said, taking the boy's sticky hand in his own. "If we leave our friend be, he may decide to take up residence in the garden. He'll make a very pretty addition, don't you think? But we must leave him alone, lest we frighten him away." It was anyone's guess whether Adam understood the man's warnings or not. He was a clever boy, but also only 2. But he allowed himself to be led away while Crowley tightened his coils and snuggled down into them, making himself comfortable. He was going to be there a while. This human was going to be tricky to get the boy away from long enough to steal him into the Goblin City. What exactly is a Goblin King? To understand this, we must first understand a bit more about the fair folk. Not very much about them. They're very prickly about their privacy after all, but enough. All of the fair folk, goblins, fairies, etc., possess the ability to create a pocket of space removed from any realm, which they are able to enter freely, the door to which they may move at will. For the most part, these spaces are small, metaphorically closet-sized. The ability is a defense mechanism, little more. A way for the fair folk to hide themselves away from prying mortal eyes very quickly, or escape elsewhere if necessary. Particularly powerful individuals can create roomier spaces for themselves, which allows them a more comfortable retreat. Goblin kings, as well as queens and fairy kings and queens and etc., are powerful enough to create entire worlds for themselves. Goblin cities and fairylands and, etc., are the names for these worlds. They are metaphysically tied to their owners, commanded by their moods and whims, and are populated by both lesser of their kind and any mortals who have wandered, or been led, into them. Crowley was not very powerful, as Goblin Kings go. His realm was not particularly big, and he'd chosen the outer edges to be bordered by a desert so that he didn't have to put in the effort of details. But compared to your average goblin, he had immense, untold power. And given that he had such a beautiful kingdom at his fingertips, it's anyone's guess why he chose to spend most of his waking time in the mortal world. Aziraphale, in case the reader is wondering, was also a fairy king, though only on a technicality. He did have a fairyland at his disposal, but he found such delight in living in the mortal world that he mostly only used it as a place to store his books. The thing about Goblin Kings is that while a Goblin King in his own realm was subject to only his own rules, there were still things that were done. Goblin Kings stole away human children. It was anyone's guess as to why. And they made mortals fall in love with them, which Crowley had never properly understood. Crowley had tried, of course, but he was very punch-clock about it, and it was always such a relief when the human realized he had no power over them, and then took the baby home. Perched on the wall here, watching the human man play with the small boy in the garden while the sun warmed his scales. Crowley was starting to realize the element he'd been missing. Over the course of the day, Crowley watched as the man read to the boy from his book, sometimes while the boy played, sometimes while he curled up near or on his guardian to listen. Crowley would have thought this would make it easier to steal the boy away. His guardian was obviously more engrossed in his book than in looking after his charge after all. But every time the boy began to succumb to the waves of curiosity that Crowley was sending his way, to draw him nearer and hopefully lead him through the gap in the wall, the man would call him back and remind him that he mustn't scare their new friend away. In fact, as he settled into his sun-warmed scales for a good sulk after his latest failure, Crowley was thinking that staying in this garden wouldn't be such a bad idea. He could listen to this wonderful man read as long as he liked, and slither around the garden being beautiful to behold, and perhaps this mortal would trust that he would remain and not take issue with proximity. The fantasy made him dizzy, and he raised himself from his coils and shook his head to banish the idea. No, there was a process, and it would be more fun in the long run to lead this man on a merry chase through his labyrinth than it would be to slink around as an ornament. Besides, he'd worked hard in the city and its labyrinth, and he wanted to show them off. He was sure that once the man saw all the effort he'd put in, he would definitely fall in love with its clever, creative Goblin King, and want to stay there forever. Crowley could bring him books, he thought, losing himself in another fantasy. All the storybooks he wanted, or any kind of books at all, and food. He'd watch the man eat their picnic lunch with such utter abandon that Crowley had no doubt food would make him happy. He would bring him food from all over the world, anything to put that look of complete bliss back on his face. But first, he had to figure out how to get the kid through the wall, or none of his fantasies would ever come to anything at all.